Due Process, winner of 25 regional Emmy Awards, including the 2014 New York Emmys for our coverage of criminal justice and current affairs. Due Process is a presentation of Rutgers School of Law, Newark, and the Edward J. Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy. Studio facilities provided by the Rutgers ITV Studio, Division of Continuing Studies.
Let's do it. Let's think about what it really means to dialogue in sophisticated ways, in classrooms, in laboratories, in the art studio, in community, in neighborhoods, in prison, in this community, bridging all those gaps.
With an emphasis as much on diversity, democracy, and civic engagement as it is on academics. She's been Chancellor of Rutgers University-Newark for just over 1 year. But for Nancy Cantor, that's been long enough to shake things up, and not just in the classroom. A chancellor with a new program, new vision for Rutgers and for Newark.
We are not just in Newark, we are of Newark.
Nancy Cantor, our only guest on this edition of Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process provided by the Fund for New Jersey, supporting informed citizens for an effective democracy. Additional funding from the New Jersey State Bar Foundation.
When you think about promoting economic and social justice in struggling cities, chances are you're not thinking university, at least not beyond who's admitted and what they pay. But then you haven't met Nancy Cantor. I'm Raymond Brown.
And I'm Sandra King, and on this edition of Due Process, some bold new ideas of what an urban university could and should be from a new kind of academic leader. She's the Chancellor of Rutgers University-Newark, and in just over 1 year, she has challenged the status quo and shaken things up on campus and off.
Dr. Nancy Cantor, welcome to Due Process.
Thank you very much.
We're glad you've joined us, and I want to start in a way that's a little unusual, which is to try to get at the core of a very complex web, because you've talked about reshaping, or at least reshaping how we think a university should relate to the urban space around it. You've looked and been a participant in the struggles over affirmative action, but in terms of leadership and other issues that haven't always been discussed, you really have challenged lots of people. And as I've read more about you and talked to people who've met you, the question is, where did this spark come from in which you challenge everybody to rethink what they think about scholarship and the role of a university?
So I think for me, honestly, it began riding the New York City subway. So I grew up in New York City, on the Upper West Side of New York City. I was telling Sandra that I grew up there before it was fancy. So I took the subway 45 minutes every day to and fro school. And on that subway, you see all of America's intelligence and all of America's diversity and all the gaps and all the challenges. And you see people with so much energy and talent who could be brought to the table to think our way collectively about the future of the world, about cities, about race, about justice, about climate change, about all the things that we know we have to tackle. And then you think of universities, and you think of a pool of expertise, a pool of knowledge that on the one hand makes progress, but can it really make progress by itself? That to me is the fundamental question. That is, why would we leave that talent that's sitting on that subway train out from the conversation if we really are committed to making progress?
And yet that argument, I'm sure you have heard many times in your career, we in academia have a different role. That's somebody else's job, not ours. You come to Rutgers University-Newark and say, we are of Newark, which means we have a responsibility and a commitment to Newark, not just on our campus, not just in our buildings, but outside. We're going to actually make a difference in this city. How do you answer those critics?
Well, so first of all, let's think about what those critics are really worried about. What they're worried about is, can they do the kind of fundamental high-impact scholarship that they thought they came to the academy to do? Or can they freely and fully educate the students they came to teach, right? Those are probably the fundamental concerns. So the question I pose back to those people is, and this may sound a little, I'm not trying to be flip, but what world are you living in, right? And what I mean by that is, how do you do high-impact scholarship without being fed by the messy challenges that are in the world, that are not in a cloister or a monastery or a university of that model?
Let me ask you to explore a typical, I know I interrupted you, but I'm excited about your ideas.
I like being interrupted. I interrupt others.
Okay. So I'm often chastened for that conduct. But it seems to me that one question is, when you look at the academy, which has in it also people who think academic freedom means I can look at whatever I want to and not be directed by the chancellor or anybody else.
Absolutely.
To the ordinary person walking through Newark who doesn't have a direct relationship to the university, what do you think is the most dynamic way of inviting them into the conversation? Because I hear you saying when we make plans, when we do planning, when we talk about how cities should be, the university's involved, but it shouldn't be telling people, but in some kind of a partnership. Right. What's the most dynamic thing you can do to make people feel welcome?
So you hit the nail on the head with one word there, partnership. So let's think about universities through two lenses. One, you could think of what my friend Harry Boyd calls the cult of the expert. I have really struggled and researched this problem, and I'm going to tell you how to answer it. And I'm going to get a grant to do that, and when my grant runs out, I'm done. I'm off to the next issue, right? Or you could think of what I like to call a community of experts. You're one, you, the scholar, are one part of a community of experts, and you sit together and collaborate and brainstorm and go back and forth and fight and figure out. Nothing comes easily. I come from a family where you fought over dinner on these issues. You don't sit there and think, I've got the answer. And I think it's that may sound so simple, but it's that change of frame that makes all the difference if you're taking on really fundamental questions. And it's not the case that this is counter to the academic freedom of choosing your own. I'm not telling anybody what to study. I'm simply saying, if you want to study metropolitan equality, if you want to study health and education and advocacy law, if you want to study the way in which climate impacts development, if you want to study brain development, if you want to study public health, if you want to study, and I could go on, and I won't. Do you really think you can thoroughly do that without being in the world? And remember, there are your students, and your students are going to be the citizens and leaders of the future. Is it okay to have them think that all the answers are in the classroom, whether the classroom is online or with walls around it? I like to talk about education for the world, in the world. You know, my best friend says, Nancy, it's not a dress rehearsal. This is the movie. Education shouldn't be preparation in the abstract. It should be the give and take of thinking through things as you can see them. John Dewey always talked about learning by doing. And it's not that everything is about action research. I am a social psychologist, so action research is a big model for me. But it's also that the very reflections you want to have on a subject can be so enriched. The example I always think for myself is when we were doing work in the city of Syracuse in the 9th poorest census tract in the nation. And we had architects and environmental sustainability folks and technologists and policy people and lawyers and everybody down in the near west side of Syracuse. And we sat there for a few explanatory conversations with residents, and we sent our architecture students to do incredible photographs and interviews. And the most stunning thing ever said was by the wisest grandmother in the 9th poorest census tract in the United States, who said, Nancy, ask us. We lay our heads down here at night. Very simple phrase, so profound. If you really think you can understand intercultural conflict or police and community or brain development and child language development, and you're not with the actors on the ground, I don't see it.
You mentioned Syracuse. For those of our audience who don't know, you came from Syracuse, where you were chancellor and president, and you had a chance to try out many of these ideas in practice. I read about the connective corridor and say yes to education. These were hands-on in the community, the university actually integrating in and bringing the outside to the campus. How did it work? Was it successful? These are such great ideas, but can they work?
So first of all, as you well know, nothing works or doesn't work, right? I mean, everything's an evolutionary process. And in fact, that's a really important point about this kind of work, because if you have a short attention span on this, forget it. Absolutely forget it. You know, when I just saw the movie about Alan Turing and the Enigma machine, and the length of time it takes to think through really difficult challenges.
But they had
So
a
one should
specific
never
doable,
think.
but in that movie, which is interesting about the Enigma machine, they had a specific doable to find a way to break the German code. So
we have
you have a long word, but do you have to match it with specific doables?
We absolutely do, and that's why you have to be out there on the ground talking. I mean, so Say Yes to Education, for example, was a district-wide, is still a district-wide school improvement, educational opportunity and access program.
But there you had metrics. You were able to actually
but you have to have
measure
such
graduation rates.
But you have to have such patience, because the change isn't overnight. You move the dial very slowly on things that have built.
How long did it take you to make a
systemic.
difference on something like education in Syracuse?
10 years, and it'll go on for the next 10 years. And probably after
Aren't
that,
there also
right?
attitudinal changes that have to happen here? Because you're talking about breaking down barriers in terms of the way, it struck me that, for example, you talk often about the global dimension of urbanization. Now, in one way that has nothing to do with Newark, and in another way it has everything to do with Newark.
Absolutely.
And I'm assuming that your idea of anchor institutions isn't just public moral land-grant schools, but also private schools. And
Syracuse was
universities.
private.
Right.
Yeah.
So
I mean, I used to joke it was about as public or private as you could get, but it was private.
But even my alma mater, Columbia, has continued struggles with the community because it hasn't.
does.
So the question is, how do you get people, how do you exercise some leadership that gets people to think past the barriers that have really encompassed their lives?
So I think one of the most important things, and you're hinting at this, is that you have to get over the suspicion on both sides, right? It's a fraught landscape of suspicion. Why are you here? Are you here really just to use us?
And what do you want from us?
What do you want from us, right? And then there's suspicion on the other side, which is this going to derail me from making progress on my scholarly life or in educating my students? Am I going to be pushed into things I can't do, asked to do too much, right? I don't want to raise expectations if I can't deliver, which goes back to your earlier question. Can you deliver, right? Did you deliver, right? So what it requires is having patience and putting as much effort into building the collaborative infrastructure as into any given project.
You need the buy-in on both sides.
You need the buy-in on both sides, and you need a sense of modesty. I mean, I always say to people, universities have to understand their place, and by that I mean not have a grandiose sense of our place, but not also have a disdain for the responsibilities of being in place. I mean, we're somewhere in the middle, right?
Nancy, my office for due process is on the same floor as the Chancellor's office for Rutgers University-Newark. I had the opportunity, even before you were officially on the job, to see a parade of people in and out of your office. I could not walk out of my office without seeing somebody I knew getting on or off of the elevator. This was the way you began. How many people would you say you saw during that period? And people from government, business, nonprofit?
Probably hundreds. I mean,
Hundreds.
Yeah, I think that's probably not, and some of it you wouldn't see because I was out in the community seeing people, but yeah.
If we look at this wealth of human contact you have and the intellectual fertility that you bring to the table, let me go to a very narrow point. 5 or 10 years from now, is there a willingness on your part to say, here are 1 or 2 concepts that I have that are sort of benchmark or flagship ideas, which I hope will inspire people and let them see the model that I'm advocating? Is there something that you would now say 5 years from now, 10 years from now, whether or not we've done X or Y or Z, or whether or not that's viable is going to be a good test of whether what I'm talking about makes sense?
So let me give you both, in a sense, in the abstract and in the concrete. So I think in the abstract, the real question will be, and is always, are we making a difference? And that sounds very both grandiose and simple, right? But what I mean by are we making a difference is, do we have faith that we have reached the talent that has otherwise is being wasted in our cities, in our nation, in our world? And are we preparing that talent in greater and greater numbers to be informed citizens and push democracy forward and push our cities and our economy and our ideas and our social fabric forward?
But let me take you then to a dark place. I'm going to pull a Sandy and ask 2 questions in a row because we're so excited to have this talk. You mentioned prisons in the speech in Sandy's presentation about you. And it seems to me the question would be, would you expect that one dynamic of this would be that mainly men but also women who have been cast aside might be part of the dynamic and even identified as part of the leadership process in the dynamic?
Absolutely, you have exactly the right point. So the concrete examples I was going to give you of success would be, so we have the Newark City of Learning Collaborative. We're launching, it's been up and running for about 13 months, but it's really being launched this Friday, actually. And this is a collaborative of government, of higher education, of nonprofits, of community-based organizations, of residents, everybody committed to raising the post-secondary attainment rate of residents of the city of Newark. In that mix are, just today, 4,000 disconnected youth in the city of Newark. It's our job to get as many of those 4,000 disconnected youth into productive, talent-giving, knowledge-based contributions that have a real future. Will we get them all? No, and this goes back to your, how do you know you succeeded and when's enough, and how
But that is measurable.
But it's measurable, absolutely measurable, and we need to feel a sense of both urgency and responsibility. Bill Fry just published a great book called The Diversity Explosion out of Brookings. Our country is, and our world for that matter, is exploding with diverse talent, and we are losing and wasting a huge, more and more of that diverse talent.
Which brings
Sending
us,
them to prison doesn't forward their life or our life.
and it brings us to the Newark School District, which is fraught with more problems than we could enumerate in the next 6 minutes.
Although it is, by the way, completely symptomatic of urban school districts across the country. I mean, you know, everybody does this number on Newark, and I can still feel like enough of an outsider that I can say,
We insiders
hold on, folks,
bemoan
hold
and
on.
bemoan.
I get your cynicism, I get the decades of trying, I get the feeling of abandonment, I get all that. But you know, I've done this work in a lot of metropolitan centers. Newark is both symptomatic of that and has the assets to really be a model. And yeah, is it going to take time? Absolutely. Is it going to take collaboration and engagement of a community of experts? Absolutely. And should it be viewed as an issue of the district, or should it be viewed as all hands on deck? We didn't get here by just not educating.
I can't believe this, but we're actually down to our last couple of minutes. But one of the things you said about Syracuse was that the work still continues in Syracuse. And so assuming that you won't be here forever, do you have a concept about how you might build a nucleus in a town that's had very imaginative people, but also fractious debates among leadership in various segments, to put it mildly, right, that you can leave behind, along with others, a cadre or a nucleus of people that are going to continue from where you...
Well, see, I think continuity and sustainability are the key words from my point of view. And that is, it is hard, and you talk about a school district, it is very hard when you have continuous changes, and you always do. Every urban district I know goes through, I mean, look at the lifespan of a superintendent of schools in America. I mean, it's just absurd. You know, the only harder thing is, I don't know, being a university chancellor, but so clearly continuity is very important, but it's also the case that, again, it goes back to whether your attention is only on those metrics or only on the project, or is it on the collaborative infrastructure that you've built? The analogy I always use for people is, I used to do consulting I still do, but for the National Science Foundation, and one time as a social psychologist of all things, they brought me in to the engineering director to talk about civil infrastructure. And at one point I said, well, okay, hold on, what is civil infrastructure? And they said, oh, it's large things attached to the ground. Oh, that's a really nice formal definition of civil. I guess social psychologist is okay here if you're engineering. It's large things attached to the ground. That has stuck with me for so long. We need the social and collaborative equivalent of large things stuck to the ground.
And with just 1 minute left, Nancy, let me ask you, we who've been in Newark all our lives have seen one plan after another come in, was all going to make a difference. Frankly, almost none of it did. How's yours going to be
So first of all,
different?
I really don't think almost none of it did.
You do?
I really don't think so. Think about the arts and cultural infrastructure of Newark. Think about that legacy. Think about the difference it makes to have El Gyron, to have NJPAC, to have Newark Museum, to have gallery without walls, to have, and those things are continuing. Those things are giving life over time. Think about the major anchor institutions, Prudential, Panasonic coming in, Audible exploding over time.
How much of that ever gets out of the downtown, Nancy?
No, it absolutely. Let's not be simplistic about downtown versus neighborhoods.
And I'm being told to wrap, so I'm going to
You
give
have
you
to
the
come
last
back. You have to
15
come back.
the last 15 seconds to tell me why I'm wrong.
We're all in it together. You make a thriving downtown as long as community is at the table in making that. So when we put our arts incubator, Express Newark in Haynes, and have thousands of students from Newark neighborhoods coming through it, it makes a difference.
And you're going to have to come back and tell us about that and affirmative action and so many other things we wanted to talk about. Nancy Cantor, thanks for spending this half hour with us on due process. And thanks to all of you for watching. We are here on 13 and NJTV 5 times a week, every week.
Or you can catch us online anytime on demand at dueprocesstv.rutgers.edu. Let us be your source for the law and justice and public policy questions that affect your life. For Sandy, producer Tanya Bentley, and all of us here, I'm Raymond Brown. See you next time on Due Process.
We are a place that knows how to reinvent ourselves and invent ourselves in a way that is consistent with our history, but that is also consistent with the needs of the times today. We will be thinking deeply about civic science, and I don't mean civics. I mean science with the people who we are with, living jointly, our neighbors. To really be sophisticated in understanding what a great urban, diverse public university can do with its neighbors in creating prosperity, civic health, and dialogue.
Want even more insight on law and justice? Become a fan of Due Process on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter and watch us on demand on YouTube.